Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of Melachim Bet, the second book of Kings. We are at chapter 16. In chapter 15, we left off we read about the story of the descent of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, into complete chaos. We learned that it was a good time. Was a time when the power of Assyria was muted. It was first growing on the scene. It wasn't yet threatening Israel, although it was looming on the horizon as the Assyrian Empire gained more and more confidence. Aram had been removed from the scene as an enemy, and it was a time. We read about the time of Yeravam, of Jeroboam II. Under which there was a tremendous amount of prosperity, with no major threatening powers. The people became wealthy and peaceful. However, they didn't use that time for good. Rather, they used that time to worsen their corruption, their decadence, and it just descended into chaos. Eventually, one king after another killing the other one, and so on and so forth. And then we mentioned briefly. We turned at the end of chapter 15 to the king of Israel, Yotam, the son of Uzziyahu, or Azariah, depending on the name. Either one. Those two kings who were faithful to God, but not particularly remarkable. But they were faithful to God. Although they did not remove the bamot, with the high places where people would sacrifice, they were worshiping God, but the sacrifices outside the temple were continuing. But overall, the assessment, at least in the book of Kings, were that those two kings were good. Now, at this time in history, and we left it off with the kingdom of Ahaz. Ahaz now becomes king. Yotam passes away, and Ahaz becomes the king of Yehuda. At this time, the king in the northern kingdom is Pekach ben Remaliahu, who came to power in a coup. So here we have, he was one of the coups that we read about before. So, Bishnas Shiva Esrei Shana LePekach ben Remaliahu, during the 17th year of the reign of Pekach in the Israelite kingdom, Malach Achaz ben Yotam Melech Yehuda. That was when Achaz, the son of Yotam, rose to the throne of Judah and became king of Judah. Now, Ahaz ben Esrim Shana Achaz b'Macho, he was 20 years old when he became king. V'sheish Esrei Shana Malach b'Yerushalayim. He ruled for 16 years in Jerusalem. V'lo asa hayashar b'einei Adonai Elohav ki David aviv. But he did not do what was proper in the eyes of God as his forefather David had been. And we were about to read that it wasn't just that he didn't do good, but he was quite an evil and corrupted king. But we're about to read of that in a moment. But I do want to paint a picture here because the political scene is important. And I also want to remind you that we had read of the encounter between Ahaz and Yeshayahu, Isaiah, who was the prophet. It was the prophet in Judah at this time. When we studied the book of Isaiah, we learned of the political advice that the prophet had given Ahaz and how Ahaz did not heed that advice at all. So let's just remember, let's paint the scene here. The Assyria is becoming more and more militant, and it is starting to grow and conquer more and more lands. So that's growing. It's a growing menace to the north, coming out of Assyria, northeast, right? And coming from approximately where modern-day Iraq is. And the menace is growing, and the smaller kingdoms, so those would be the kingdoms of Aram, which has fallen under Syria, but then also the kingdoms of Tyre, for example, the kingdoms of the Edomites, which is to the southeast, the kingdoms of the Philistines, who are still in that area, where the Philistines area is roughly where modern day Gaza is, and of course the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So all of these kingdoms were being threatened by the advance of Assyria. those kingdoms, their only strategy that made sense to them was to band together and create a vast alliance to counter the influence of Assyria. And to do that would require all of the small kingdoms in the area to ally themselves together and thus act as a defense against the encroaching Assyrian power. Now, the Ahaz had a different thing in mind. So Pekach ben Remaliahu and the other kings were trying to band together and create this alliance. However, Judah, under the leadership of Ahaz had this tremendous affinity for Assyrian culture. He looked at Assyria's power, and he thought to himself, we should ally ourselves with Assyria, right? And if we become like them and live like them and ally ourselves militarily and politically with them, that would be the best course of action for us here in Jerusalem. And understanding that approach of Ahaz helps us understand how aggressively he wanted to get rid of all of what made Judah special, all of what made Judah independent, most specifically the religion and culture. So he wanted to destroy Judaism, right? Destroy the worship of the one God, and adopt the ways of the Assyrians and those other nations that had already been engulfed by the Assyrian Empire, and thus assure the security of his kingdom. So, understanding that background, and now this was very much against the advice of the prophet Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah, as we studied in the book of Isaiah, advised Ahaz strongly to remain independent, not to worry about the alliance of kings against him, the smaller kings, right? And not to ally themselves with Assyria for two basic reasons Yeshayahu gave in the book of Isaiah, which were, number one, they're not a reliable ally, because even though you ally yourselves with them now, right, they're going to come and destroy those other kingdoms, and eventually they're going to come and destroy you despite all of your attempts at being like them and joining them and allying yourselves with them. Eventually, and history had proved Isaiah to be completely correct. In other words, your alliance with them, you think it's going to help you, but it's not going to help you. People like them are not going to ever be reliable allies. They're going to turn against you too. Once they start getting hungrier and hungrier and greedier and conquer more and more, eventually they're going to turn against you too, which is, of course, what happened in a big way during the life of Ahaz's son, Chizkiyahu, or Hezekiah, which we're going to get to. And second of all, because you need to stay faithful to God. Obviously, the throwing out everything that Judah stands for, everything that makes Judah special, is not the path. Just acting like the Assyrians. But Ahaz, of course, did not listen to Isaiah at all, as we shall see. So let's do verse number 3, understanding this what I just described. So Vayelech b'derech Malchei Yisrael. He went, in other words, spiritually, he went in the very bad path of the kings of Israel. In other words, he worshipped idols. He did not stay faithful to God. V'games b'no havir b'eish. It was so bad that he even sacrificed his son in flames, kito avos hagoyim, in the same way as the abominations of those nations, asher horish Adonai osam pnei bnei Yisrael, that God had gotten rid of those nations in the face of the Israelites. When the people of Israel came to the land of Israel, God rid the land of those nations that practiced such awful things, which eventually idol worship leads to sacrifice, in other words, to appease the gods, and eventually one comes to sacrifice his or her most valuable and most precious thing, which is their child. That is the ultimate end result of taking that terrible path. And the hint being given here that Ahaz was so bad that he was as bad as the nations that God got rid of in order to establish the people of Israel. In other words, the entire moral journey of the people of Israel has now turned completely backwards and on its head, so that they're not even worthy of the land. That's the hint that one would get from this verse in verse 3. Verse 4, Vayizabeach vayikater b'amamot, and he went and he and he sacrificed and he brought incense on the high places, Vyal Hagvaot, and in the hills, Vitachas Koletz Ranon, and under every leafy green tree. Az Ya'aleh Ritzin Melech Aram. So now, Ritzin, the king of Aram, which had been subdued, right, by Assyria, but not yet fully conquered by Assyria. So Ritzin and Pekach ben Ramalyahu, and Pekach, the son of Ramalyahu, Melech Yisrael, the king of Israel. Those are two of the smaller kings that are trying to create this alliance against Assyria. And because Ahaz refused to join them, they wanted to forcibly remove Ahaz from the kingdom, from the kingship, and replace him with a loyal king so that the kingdom of Judah would then join them in their alliance. So they went up against Yerushalayim la milchama, against Jerusalem at war, vayatzuru al Ahaz v'lo yachlu lahilachem. And they laid siege to over Ahaz, and his power in Jerusalem, but they were not able to conquer him. So Be'esa, he at this time, Heshiv Ritzin Melech Aram et Eilat la'Aram. However, despite the fact that they couldn't conquer him, they did do significant damage to the Judean kingdom. They took Eilat, the port of Eilat, which is a very important port, which we read about several times, giving access to the sea and trade with Africa and so on. That port was taken back from Judah by Aram. And they got rid of the people of Judah, the Judeans, from that place, Elot. The Adomim ba'u Eilat, and the Edomites came to Eilat, vayeshu sham, and they settled there out of Hilmazeh. So the Edomites came and took over that area in the south. Vayishlach Achaz malachim el Tiglat Pileser melech Ashur lemar. So Ahaz, because he wanted to make, the way he felt he was going to save himself from this alliance of kings that he did not want to join, he went ahead and paid tribute to Tiglat-Pileser, the king of Assyria, saying as follows: Abducha uvincha ani, I am your servant, I am your son. Alei v'hoshieni, come and save me, mikaf melech Aram, mikaf melech Yisrael hakomim alai. Save me from the king of Aram and the king of Israel who are coming up against me. So here he establishes himself and attempts to get favor from Tiglat-Pileser, from the king of Assyria, against these kings. And he took the silver and gold that was in the temple of God, and what he had stored in the storehouses, the treasure houses of the king. And he sent the king of Assyria a bribe, so he sent him money, and all in order to get his help against his enemies. So he was suffering, he suffered losses, he lost a lot, he was under siege, so that's what he did. Vayishmael melech Ashur, and the king of Assyria heeded his call. Vayal melech Ashur al Damascus, and he went to Damascus. Vayitpiseha, and he captured Damascus. Remember, Damascus is the capital of Aram, which is one of the allies of the kingdom of Israel, and one of the people who is laying siege to Jerusalem and attacking Jerusalem. So Assyria went and attacks Damascus. He captures it. Vayagleha kira ve'etritzin hemis, and he exiled the people of Damascus to Kir, some other place. This is foreshadowing the Assyrian policy of exiling the peoples so that they cannot regroup and try to recreate their nation and then eventually be a possible source of rebellion. They just exiled them, get rid of their national identity, as we see, unfortunately, they're going to do soon to the northern kingdom of Israel as well. And they killed Ritzin, the king of Aram. So here you have the king of Assyria doing this at the behest of the call of Judah to be an ally. And however, for the most part, they were doing this out of their own greed, their own desire to expand their empire. Vayelech hamelech Achaz, so the king Ahaz went likras Tiglat-Pileser melech Ashur Damascus. He went to Damascus to congratulate his new ally, right? Vayares hamizbeach asher b'Damascus, and when he was there, he saw the mizbeach, the altar that was in Damascus. Presumably, this was a an Assyrian style, even though it was in Aram. The question here is this an Assyrian altar, or is this an altar that was placed by the by the Arameans to their god? So was this a temple built to the god of Aram, the people that were just conquered, or to the god of Assyria? Presumably it was to the god of Assyria, because that's what Aram wanted to cozy himself up to. And when he saw this Mizbeach, he really loved the way it looked. So and he wanted to totally establish Jerusalem and Judah as completely subservient to Assyria. So in order to be subservient, he needed to adopt their religion and their practices, and build altars that are similar in style to theirs. So Vayishlach HaMelech Achaz El Uriah HaKohen, the king Ahaz sent a document at Demut HaMizbeach v'Tavnitzu l'Chomaseu, plans and pictures and diagrams, so that Uriah, who was the high priest in Jerusalem, could fashion a Mizbeach looking exactly like this Assyrian altar that we found in Damascus. So Vayiven Uriah HaKohen's Mizbeach, and just to show how deep the corruption had went, the high priest himself went ahead and built the altar. K'chol asher sholach HaMelech Achaz miDamasek, kenas Uriah HaKohen ad bo HaMelech Achaz miDamasek. He built it exactly according to the instructions that Ahaz the king had sent him, so that when the king Ahaz came back from Damascus, Vayavo HaMelech miDamasek, the next verse 12, Vayar HaMelech es HaMizbeach, he saw the altar, Vayikrav HaMelech al Mizbeach Vayal alav, and he went and he sacrificed on this Mizbeach, and went up upon this altar to worship the god of Assyria. This is how bad it had gotten. By Akteret Olaso v'et minchaso, he burned his olah, his burnt offering, and his grain offering. By Aseches Nisko, and he poured his wine. By Yizrok et dam hashlomim asher lo al mizbeach, and the blood of the peace offerings he sprinkled onto that altar rather than the altar of God. And yet Mizbeach and Achoshes, it gets worse. The copper altar, Asher Lefnei Adonai, which was in God's temple, which was the one meant to worship the one God, Vayakrev me'es pnei abayis, right? Amibein HaMizbeach u'mibein beis Adonai, Vayiteno so al yerach HaMizbeach tzafona, right? He brought it from before the house. He moved it away, right, where it was standing between, we were standing, right in front of the holy portion. In other words, the mizbeach is in the yard outside of the holy room of the temple, the heichal, in which the menorah and the altar of incense was. The mizbeach stands right outside that door. You have to look at a diagram of how the temple was laid out if you're not familiar with that. But he moved it away, right? And he he put it so that his own altar was closer to the mizbeh, to the entrance. So in other words, he pushed away the altar of God in order to replace it with his altar. This is what he did in the temple itself. And then he told the high priest as follows, Uriah as follows: Al mizbeach hagadol, on this big mizbeach, in other words, the new one, that's where you're going to bring the carbonot from now on. That's where you're going to bring the sacrifices. These are listing all of the regular sacrifices, the morning sacrifice, the afternoon sacrifice, etc. And all of the sacrifices that are brought by the people of the land, all of their grain offerings and their libations, and all of the blood, the blood of burnt offerings, and the blood of peace offerings. Olav tizrok, you should spray on the mizbeach, on the altar of the Assyrian altar that I am putting in there. Mizbeach hanachoshes yeli levaker, and the mizbeach hanachoshet, the altar of God, the copper mizbeach, I'm just going to leave that. I'll visit it every once in a while, so we won't get rid of it. We'll put it on the side. And but all this worship should now happen on this new altar. Vayas Uriah HaKohen k'chol asher tziva Melech Achaz, and Uriah the high priest did exactly as the king Ahaz had asked. So here you have the total capitulation of even the religious leadership, which should have been faithful to God, capitulation to Ahaz and his plan to Assyrianize everything about Judah, including idol worship within the temple itself. And in order to demonstrate the supremacy of Assyrian religion over Judean religion, he cut off the miskirot. Those are like borders, like decorative borders that are around the kiyar, where the wash basin, right, which was decorated. So he took that off. Ayasar me'aleim esakiyar v'esayam horid, and then the large basin of water, the large, which is called the sea of Shlomo, of Solomon, that he had placed, which was a huge water source, right, and it was resting on oxen, right, on metal statues of oxen. So these were that were holding the big yam. You can look back in the beginning of the first book of Kings for that description. He took them off me'al habakar nechoshes asher tachta. He took them off of the copper or bronze bakar cattle that were there holding it up, and he took it down in order to show the people that God's temple is being taken down. God's temple is no longer standing up in an honorable way, but we're putting it down. And he put it on just a bunch of stones, on a floor of stones. Viet hashabat, and the vet musach hashabat, and the hashabat, right? There's a special passage like that was set for the Sabbath day. Asher banu babayis, that was built in the house of the temple, an honorable place that was built where they would go on the Shabbat. Viet muvo hamelach achitzona, and the outer passageway through which the king would enter. Heisev beis Adonai mepnei melech Ashur. He turned them so that now they faced, instead of God's temple, they faced the king of Assyria. V'yeser divrei Achaz asher. So in other words, bad stuff. Okay, here's Achaz doing all of this. All of the other things that Achaz did, Haloim Ksuvim, if you want to read about them, El Sefer Divrei Hayam Malach, go ahead and read the history books that describe the history of the kings of Judah. So here we have Achaz described as a king who basically sold out everything to the Assyrians. It's hard to imagine things getting worse in the southern kingdom. Now, Vayishkav Achaz im Avosav, Achaz passed away, and he Vayikaver im Avosav bir David, he was buried in the city of David with his forebears, with the previous kings. Vayimloch Chizkiyahu v'no tachtav, and Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, his son, became king after him. As we're going to see soon, Chizkiyahu is going to restore the worship of God and rescue the king of Judah from what otherwise would have been probably a similar fate to the northern kingdom of Israel. If not for Hezekiah, which we're going to read about soon, the southern kingdom would have descended into a very similar path. So Ahaz, obviously a bad king, a king that made an alliance with Syria, which, as foretold and as predicted by and as advised by Ishayahu, Isaiah, this alliance is not going to last very long, because as soon as Assyria finishes conquering the smaller kings, the northern kingdom, he's going to turn his attention to conquering Judah as well. And that will unfortunately be the invasion that Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, is going to have to deal with in the years to come. In the meantime, as we said, Pekach ben Remaliahu is leading the northern kingdom. He's as corrupt can be, and he's trying to assemble this alliance with all the other smaller kings against Assyria. And we are going to turn to the northern kingdom in the next chapter, and the ultimate destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians. Thank you so much for studying this together with me today, for studying chapter 16, a painful chapter, a difficult chapter, but important for us to learn and understand. Looking forward to studying chapter 17 and the rest of the book of Kings together. Have a wonderful day.